What would you do if a dying child showed up on your land? A stranger's son, branded an enemy by everyone you know. Would you risk everything to save him? The Texas sun hung like a molten coin in the sky, its relentless glare turning Red Hollow into a furnace of cracked earth and brittle grass. Ellen Pruitt stood barefoot on the porch of her cabin, shotgun slung across her back, eyes scanning the endless horizon. 3 years had passed since her husband, Elijah, died from a rattlesnake bite, leaving her alone in a land where trust was a currency spent quickly. The porch boards creaked beneath her weight, their weathered groans the only sound in a silence broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Her corn had withered weeks ago, its stalks now brittle sentinels standing guard over parched soil. Her rain barrel, once a lifeline, was nearly bone dry, its hollow thud a daily reminder of the drought's grip. For days, no riders had passed the southern trail, a rare stillness that should have felt like peace, but instead prickled her skin with unease. But as the sun dipped behind a ridge, casting long shadows that clawed at the dust, she spotted something unnatural in the tall yellow grass. A faint, twitching shape that wasn't the wind or a trick of the light. Ellen's breath hitched. She'd learned to read the prairie's language, the way the grass bent under the weight of a coyote's paw, the flicker of snake's tail, the shimmer of heat rising from stone. This was different. This was alive. Ellen approached cautiously, rifle clutched tight, every muscle coiled like a spring. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and decay, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Her boots stirred up small clouds of dust as she closed the distance, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. The figure resolved into a boy, no older than 12, his bronze skin slick with sweat and blood, his braided hair matted with dirt and dried leaves. A bullet wound tore through his left shoulder, crudely bandaged with grass and sinew, the makeshift dressing soaked through and crawling with flies. His lips were parched and cracked, his chest rising in shallow, uneven hitches. Ellen's heart thundered. She knew what he was, a Comanche, but she also knew what folks would say if they found her standing over him. A woman alone in a lawless corner of Texas, tending to a wounded Indian boy? It was enough to get her shot, or worse. Yet, as she knelt beside him, his glassy black eyes meeting hers, she made a choice no one would understand. His gaze didn't plead or beg. It simply held hers, steady and unflinching, as if he'd already accepted his fate. Ellen pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, the fever burning through her gloves. "Hey now," she whispered, her voice softer than she intended. "Don't you quit." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. She slid her arms beneath his wiry frame, grunting under his wiry weight, and lifted him. His body stiffened at the movement, a silent gasp escaping his lips, but no cry followed. Inside the cabin, she laid him gently on Elijah's old cot, the springs groaning under the sudden load. The room smelled of dust, gun oil, and years of stubborn survival. A scent that had once felt like home, but now felt suffocating. By the flickering firelight, Ellen's stitches wound with shaking hands, her needle weaving through flesh with the precision of a woman who'd patched too many things in her life. Elijah's torn shirts, her own broken resolve, the cracks in her heart. As she worked, she whispered stories of Elijah's laugh, of the twins they'd lost to a winter fever, of the panther she'd fought off with a shovel when it came for her chickens. The boy didn't speak until dawn, when he rasped, "Amos Creed." His name. Ellen pressed a spoon of broth to his lips, her throat tight. "You're safe here." But even as she spoke, she knew the lie. Outside, the wind carried warnings. The rustle of mesquite branches, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of the well's windmill spinning in a breeze that didn't exist. Someone had shot him. Someone was looking for him. And if they found him here, no name or good intention would save her. The boy's eyes fluttered shut, his breathing steadying, But Ellen didn't sleep. She sat in the rocker by the door, shotgun across her knees, watching the horizon bleed from black to gray. The storm she'd felt in the air hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. She just didn't know from which direction. By morning, the air in Red Hollow felt heavier, as if the prairie itself were holding its breath. Ellen reinforced the lock on her door with a splintered plank of oak. Not that it would stop bullets, but it offered a fragile illusion of safety. Inside the cabin, the scent of boiled water mingled with the lingering bitterness of yarrow and sagebrush she'd used to treat Amos's fever. The boy slept fitfully on Elijah's old cot, his face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. His breathing had steadied, but his hands twitched as if chasing shadows in his dreams. Ellen watched him for a moment, the weight of her decision pressing down like the Texas sun. She draped a woolen shawl over his shoulders, then stepped outside with her Winchester cradled in her arms, scanning the horizon. The plains stretched empty, save for the skeletal remains of mesquite trees and a distant silhouette of Buzzard's Bluff. Yet the stillness felt deceptive. Ellen's fingers tightened on a rifle stock. The air had that thick, expectant weight to it, the kind that settles just before lightning strikes. She could almost hear the ghost of her husband's voice warning her. Silence ain't always peace, Ellen. Sometimes it's the calm before the storm. The hoofbeats came sharp and purposeful, slicing through the quiet like a blade. 3 riders emerged from the dust, their silhouettes stark against the morning haze. Ellen's stomach knotted as she recognized Micah Black's broad shoulders and the cruel twist of his mouth. Beside him, Captain Levi Tanner, tall and sharp-featured, adjusted his hat with a practiced politeness that masked the steel beneath. The third rider, a lean ranger with a scar splitting his lip, lingered at the edge of the group, eyes darting like a man accustomed to ambushes. "Mornin', ma'am," Tanner called, his voice smooth but edged with authority. "Mind if we speak a spell?" Ellen kept her stance neutral, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "Depends. What about?" Black dismounted first, his boots crunching gravel as he closed the distance. "We're tracking a wounded Comanche boy," he said, his gaze boring into her. "Blood trail leads close to your land. You'd be doing the valley a favor if you told us where he is." Ellen folded her arms, letting the rifle's weight anchor her. "The only thing I've seen out here is the wind and too little rain." Her voice was steady, but her mind raced. She stepped aside, gesturing them in. "You're welcome to look, but I won't be bullied." As they entered, she flicked a glance toward the cot. Amos lay hidden beneath a mound of flour sacks and Elijah's moth-eaten coats, his breath shallow enough to mimic the stillness of supplies. The ranger with the scar trailed his fingers along the cabin's shelves, disturbing layers of dust. Tanner lifted a quilt, letting it drop with a resigned sigh. Black lingered near the hearth, his boot nudging a patch of dried blood Ellen had scrubbed half-heartedly into the floorboards. "Rabbit," she said instantly, stepping between him and the cot. "Caught one in a trap yesterday." Black's eyes narrowed, but Tanner intervened. "Appreciate your time, Mrs. Pruitt," he said, tipping his hat. The men filed out, but Black paused at the threshold. "They'll be back," he murmured, his breath hot against her cheek. "Next time with more men. Maybe worse." Inside, the cabin seemed to exhale. Amos stirred, his dark eyes fluttering open. "You risk much?" he rasped, his voice like sandpaper. Ellen stared at him, startled. "You understood all that?" He nodded, wincing as he shifted. "English slow, but I learn." She slid down the doorframe, her knees buckling under the weight of adrenaline and fear. "They'll come back," she whispered. Black's not the type to let go. Amos sat up slowly, teeth clenched against the pain in his shoulder. "Then I must leave." "Your danger, my fault." Ellen shook her head, surprising herself with her own resolve. "No, not yet." She met his gaze, her voice softening. "You're not strong enough. And I've buried too many people to let another die if I can help it." He studied her, the weight of unspoken debts heavy in his young eyes. Outside, the wind stirred the dust, carrying whispers of the storm to come. Neither spoke of what lay ahead. The riders who'd circle back, the secrets Amos carried, or the fragile line Ellen now straddled between mercy and ruin. For now, the lie held. But lies, like storms, have a way of breaking wide open. Days passed in a haze of tension and quiet labor, the air around red hollow thickening like a storm cloud ready to burst. Amos's strength returned slowly, his movements growing steadier as he paced the cabin's cramped quarters or sat sharpening his blade by the fire. Yet outside, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Strangers began to circle the cabin. First Apache scouts, their faces painted with ochre streaks, then Yamparico warriors, their eyes cold as flint. They rode close enough to be seen, but kept their distance, lingering like shadows at dusk. One evening, a Yamparico rider spat on the ground near the well, his words sharp and bitter in Comanche. "Poison," he hissed, jabbing a finger toward Ellen. Amos stepped forward, his voice low but unyielding. "She has more honor than men who leave a boy to die." The warrior sneered but turned away, his horse snorting as he rode off into the gathering gloom. At night, the drums began, a slow, rhythmic thud-thud-thud that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Ellen sat bolt upright in her rocker, rifle across her lap, every beat echoing in her chest like a countdown. "They come," Amos whispered one night, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon where the sound swelled. Ellen tightened her grip on the rifle, her knuckles pale. "Oh," she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The ones who fear peace," he said, his voice hollow. Amos revealed fragments of his secret in whispers, piecing together a map of betrayal and hope. "My father speaks of treaties," he said, his hands tracing patterns in the dust on the floor. "Talks with white men who promise land and peace. But some of our people, they want blood instead." Ellen's mind raced. The boy wasn't just a fugitive. He was a living testament to a fragile possibility, a bridge between worlds that others wanted burned. "They'll kill you to keep that peace from happening," she murmured, the truth settling like lead in her stomach. "And me for helping you." He nodded, his expression grim. "They measure you, how long you last." By afternoon, Ellen moved with frantic purpose. She hauled buckets of water from the well until her arms ached, burying a pouch of dried venison and hardtack in a jar beneath the floorboards. She cleaned the rifle until the barrel gleamed, checked each window for gaps in the shutters, and dragged Elijah's cot away from the door, its creaking springs a mournful soundtrack to her efforts. Amos hovered nearby, his shoulders still stiff but his eyes sharp. "Here," he said, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth near the barn. "Boot prints. Fresh." He crouched, brushing his fingers over the ground. "They watch," he said simply. "Someone always watches." Ellen followed his gaze to the mesquite thicket, where the wind stirred the branches into restless shapes. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. That night, Ellen lit an oil lamp, its flickering glow casting long shadows across the cabin walls. She sat by the hearth, her hands wrapped around a chipped tin mug of lukewarm coffee. "Sometimes I talk to Elijah out loud," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "Like he's still here. Is that mad?" Amos looked up from a knife he'd been sharpening, his dark eyes calm. "Not mad," he replied. "In my people, we speak to those who've crossed. Sometimes they answer in dreams." Ellen managed a faint smile, though her throat tightened. "Then I hope Elijah's listening," she said, staring into the fire. "We're going to need all the help we can get." Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the cabin walls like a wounded animal. A lone coyote's cry split the night, and from the north, the drums grew louder, a steady, relentless boom, boom, boom that seemed to sync with Ellen's pulse. Not thunder, not horses, drums. Amos stood abruptly, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "They're testing us," he said, his voice taut, "waiting for weakness." Ellen rose slowly, her muscles aching with fatigue, but her resolve hardening. "Then let's show them none," she said, reaching for the rifle. Together, they stood by the window, watching the dark prairie swallow the stars. The drums didn't stop, neither did they blink. At dawn, the Texas sky was a bruised canvas of gray and rose, the horizon trembling under the weight of an approaching storm. Ellen stood on her porch, her breath curling in the chill air as she spotted three riders silhouetted on the ridge across the creek. They didn't move, didn't gesture, just lingered like smoke caught mid-drift. One held a spyglass, its lens catching the first light of morning. The others sat motionless, their stillness unnerving. "They're watching," Amos murmured behind her, his voice low but steady. "Not my father's men. Others." Ellen nodded grimly, her fingers tightening around the Winchester propped against the doorframe. The weight of the past 3 days pressed against her ribs. The shared meals, the whispered stories, the fragile trust built between a woman who'd buried her world and a boy who carried the burden of a future he might never see. But now that time was up. Someone else had found the boy. And whoever they were, they hadn't come to talk. By afternoon, the cabin became a fortress of quiet preparation. Ellen dragged Elijah's cot away from the window, its creaking springs a mournful soundtrack to her resolve. She wrapped her Winchester in a quilt by the door, its bulk a silent promise of defiance. Only one oil lamp glowed, its flame casting jittery shadows across the walls. A kettle steamed on the stove, its rising vapor fogging the glass. A feeble shield against prying eyes, but enough to obscure the truth. Amos sat cross-legged by the fire, sharpening his blade with deliberate strokes. The rasp of steel against stone filled the silence until he spoke. "I think they don't want me alive," he said, his eyes fixed on the blade. "Why?" Ellen asked, though the answer hung in the air like dust. He hesitated, the firelight etching lines of weariness into his young face. "I carry secrets," he said at last. "My father told me of meetings, talks with white men, treaties not yet signed. Some command war instead." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They fear that." Ellen's throat tightened. She understood now. Amos wasn't just a fugitive. He was proof that peace was possible, a living contradiction to the hatred festering in the hearts of men who thrived on bloodshed. Outside, the night deepened into a suffocating black, broken only by the crackle of embers in the hearth. Just before the oil lamp guttered out, Ellen noticed it, the edge of her well, disturbed as if someone had knelt there, inspecting its depth. Not dug, not damaged, just measured. Her stomach churned. Whoever they weren't testing her defenses. They were calculating how long she could survive them. At dawn, Ellen filled her canteens with water drawn from the well, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. Amos insisted on joining her as she set traps further out, where the mesquite thicket still held stubborn life. "If I stay inside, I grow weak," he said, adjusting the sash over his healed shoulder. "I must feel the land." They moved like ghosts, their boots silent on the brittle earth. He showed her how to read the language of the prairie. A snapped branch meant fresh passage. The tilt of grass revealed the direction of a breeze and the path of unseen watchers. She taught him how to spot deer runs by the way the soil dipped near water, their shared knowledge stitching together two worlds in quiet defiance of the violence closing in. But the signs were grim. A cold fire pit under a cedar, still holding the scent of damp ash. Hoofprints circling her property like wolves. And the most chilling discovery of all, a single black-dipped feather hung from a branch at the forest's edge. Amos froze, his hand gripping Ellen's arm. "Yamparica, war mark," he hissed, his voice taut with dread. "Enemies to peace. Not just to me." Back at the cabin, the evidence mounted, shutters bent as if pried open, boot prints near the back door, their soles caked with red clay from the river. Elijah's coat, gone from the drying line, left as a message. Whoever they were, They wanted her to know they'd been close. "They'll come before dawn," Amos said, his blade flashing in the dim light. "Then we'll be ready before they are," Ellen replied, her voice hard as flint. She checked the rifle's load, her hands moving with the precision of a woman who'd spent a lifetime preparing for the worst. Amos fashioned a spear from an old fence post, wrapping the blade in leather to muffle sound. Together, they laid tin can noisemakers by the windows, their clatter a warning system against the dark. As evening fell, Ellen stood by the hearth, staring into the flames. "You were afraid that first day?" Amos said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "I was," she admitted. "But you stayed." "I did." She turned to him, the boy who had become a symbol of something larger than either of them. "Because you were dying, and because I've lost people before. You gave me a life debt. I didn't do it for a debt." "I know," he said softly. "That's why it matters." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and something colder. The intent of men who saw no future beyond fire and blood. The storm was coming, and this time, Ellen would meet it with both hands steady on the rifle. The wind shifted just after midnight, carrying with it the brittle rattle of a tin noisemaker, a makeshift alarm rigged near the edge of the porch. Ellen jolted awake, her body coiled tight as a spring, every nerve screaming. The sound wasn't loud, not a full alarm, but it was deliberate, testing, watching, counting windows, measuring fear. She reached for the Winchester tucked under her bed, its weight a familiar anchor, and scanned the room. Amos was already crouched low beside the hearth, his knife glinting in the dim moonlight. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, locked onto the door. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The boy's silence was louder than any shout. They're here, and they're ready. Outside, the wind howled through the mesquite thicket, bending branches into restless shapes. Ellen's breath fogged the air as she pressed her ear to the splintered wood of the door. The faint scrape of boots on gravel confirmed it. They were circling again, probing the cabin's defenses like wolves testing the walls of a pen. Then came the knock, deliberate a statement. Not frantic, not angry, but heavy with intent. "Micah Black, ma'am." A voice called, rough and familiar. "Sheriff's deputy out of Devil's Creek." Ellen's jaw tightened. She'd last seen Black at the town hall meeting, where he bellowed about driving Comanche north by gunpoint. Now he wore a badge and a grudge. "We're tracking a wounded boy," he continued, voice too polite. "He's wanted for questioning. Last seen near your property." "Boy's not here," Ellen replied, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. A lie, but not entirely. Amos was no boy anymore. Not after 3 days of shared survival. Not after the way he'd faced death and emerged sharper, fiercer. "You'd really protect one of them?" Black's tone sharpened, laced with venom. "After what they've done, you want people thinking you're one of their sympathizers." Ellen's grip on the rifle knuckles white. "I saved a dying child," she snapped. "If that's a crime now, go ahead and shoot me for it." Silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then the crunch of boots on dirt. They're moving. A fist slammed hard against the door, the impact vibrating through the floorboards. Amos materialized beside her, blade raised, his breath steady despite the fevered heat of his scarred shoulder. "We fight," he murmured, the question a whisper against the tension. "Not unless we have to," she whispered back, though her finger hovered near the trigger. "But we hold the line." By dawn, 7 riders loomed on the southern ridge, their silhouettes stark against the blood-red horizon. Ellen climbed to the roof with Elijah's old spyglass, its brass frame cold in her hands. Through the cracked lens, she recognized Black's hat, a wide-brimmed relic stained with sweat and spite, and beside him, Naco, a rancher who'd lost 2 sons to last year's raids. Grief had carved lines into his face, turning his grief into a weapon. "They mean to force our hand," she muttered, descending the ladder. Amos tightened a strip of leather over his healed shoulder, his posture unwavering. "Then we move first." "You mean run?" Ellen asked, though she already knew his answer. He shook his head, pulling a rawhide pouch from his satchel. No, we sent a message. Inside were crushed herbs, dried petals, and powdered ochre. Carefully, he knelt by the hearth, pressing his fingers into the dust to form a symbol, an eagle's wing above a river. Peace sign, he said, his voice low. Even the Yamparika scouts would recognize it. Ellen studied the symbol, its curves and angles of fragile hope etched in dirt. And if they don't care, Amos met her gaze, his eyes old beyond his years. Then they've already chosen war. She rode out alone, the stone tied to a long stick like a flag of truce. The prairie swallowed her horse's hooves, the silence oppressive as she approached the ridge. Black's men watched, rifles slung across their laps, their faces masks of suspicion. Ellen planted the stone upright between the two groups, a neutral ground, a chance, and turned back slowly, never breaking stride, never showing fear. By dusk it still stood. Beside it lay a second sign, an arrow unbroken, wrapped in white cloth. "They wait," Amos said when she returned, his voice tinged with cautious relief. "One day, then they come." Ellen leaned against the doorframe, exhaustion seeping into her bones. The wind carried the scent of rain, but the storm brewing wasn't in the sky. It was in the hearts of men. She glanced at Amos, sharpening his blade by firelight, and wondered if mercy could outlast bullets. "Then we prepare for the day after," she said quietly. Because peace never held without teeth behind it. Because sometimes surviving the night meant believing the dawn might listen. Outside, the night deepened. The fire crackled, and somewhere beyond the hills, the drums began to beat again. The riders came just after sunrise, their silhouettes etched against the blood-orange sky like phantoms rising from the earth. Ellen stood on the porch, her breath shallow as she watched the two groups crest the ridge. One led by Micah Black, his rifle resting across his lap like a coiled snake. The other by Quanah, chief of the Quadi, his posture as unyielding as the mesquite trees that dotted the plains. Black's posse included grieving ranchers and Texas Rangers, their faces carved by loss and fury, while the Comanche warriors rode in silence, their feathers and war paint stark against the morning light. The air thrummed with tension, the kind that precedes gunfire, as the two factions halted within earshot of the cabin, neither yielding ground. Inside, Ellen had made no attempt to hide. The door stood open, the rifle across the table untouched, a deliberate gesture of defiance and trust. Amos stood beside the window, his healed shoulder wrapped in a ceremonial sash, his posture rigid but calm. "You sure about this?" Ellen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her. "Even if they come shooting," he replied, "then I'll fall standing." Black dismounted first, spitting into the dirt with a grunt of disgust. He paced in front of the cabin, his boots crunching gravel, before barking, "We've had enough talk, enough waiting. You've got a savage in your house, and we're here to finish this." His voice cracked like a whip, but before Ellen could respond, Quanah's low, deliberate command cut through the air. Amos stepped forward, his voice steady and unflinching as he translated. "He says the boy you hunt is under his protection now. That blood answers for blood, but not this day." The words hung heavy, a challenge and a plea woven into one. Black sneered, his jaw tight. "You think a painted chief gets to speak for the law out here?" His hand hovered near his belt, but then Caleb Morrow rode forward, a rancher with two sons buried in unmarked graves, yet also a man whose daughter had been returned alive by Comanche warriors. Morrow's eyes swept the scene. Ellen's calm resolve, Amos's quiet dignity, Quanah's unwavering stare, before settling on Black. "You don't speak for us anymore, Micah," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "This boy helped save my daughter. That chief kept his word, and I won't see this land turn to fire again because of your hate." The admission rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Black's hand twitched toward his holster, But Quanah moved, a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence commanding without menace. He unwrapped a cloth bundle to reveal a cavalry saber, its blade dented and stained with old blood. This, he said in halting English, was taken from Moro's son, recovered from men who followed Kickingbird. Not my warriors, not this boy's hand. He laid the weapon in the dust at Moro's feet, the gesture as much an accusation as a peace offering. Moro dismounted, his boots stirring the dirt as he picked up the saber. His fingers traced the hilt, the weight of memory pressing down like the Texas sun. Slowly he nodded. The shift was imperceptible at first. A loosening of shoulders, averted eyes, the creak of saddle leather as men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Black's jaw clenched, his hand dropping from his belt to his thigh, his knuckles whitening around his knee. The threat dissipated like mist under midday heat. Behind him, Nako spat into the dirt and turned his horse away. One by one, the others followed, their silence a verdict. Black lingered, his glare slicing toward Ellen. "You still proud of your pet Comanche?" he hissed. "Still think he's different?" Ellen stepped onto the porch, her voice cutting through the haze. "I don't think he's different," she said. "I know he is, just like I know you're not." Black's lip curled, but he mounted his horse without another word, his retreat a slow, bitter crawl back to the ridge. As the dust settled, Quanah turned to Amos, speaking in their native tongue. The boy translated, his voice soft. He says today, "Peace grows roots." But roots must be watered. Ellen nodded, the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs. The riders were gone, but the land would always remember what nearly happened and what almost burned. That night, the cabin held more people than ever before. A fragile gathering of settlers and Comanche warriors, their presence a testament to the uneasy truce that had emerged from the day's reckoning. The air inside was thick with the mingling scents of wood smoke, boiled beans, and damp earth, while the fire crackled and spat, casting long shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. For the first time in years, the space that had once been Ellen's fortress of solitude now buzzed with unfamiliar voices. Settlers leaned against the hearth, their rifles propped idly in corners, while Comanche warriors sat cross-legged on the floor, their war paint smudged by the soot drifting from the flames. Amos stood at the center, his voice weaving a tapestry of stories in both English and Comanche, his hands gesturing to punctuate every twist and turn. He spoke of the prairie's hidden trails, the way coyotes howl before a storm, and the time Ellen had fought off a panther with a shovel, a tale that drew laughter from even the grimmest faces. Moro, the rancher who had once buried 2 sons, passed around a jug of whiskey, its warmth softening edges and loosening tongues. A Texas ranger, his face etched with years of frontier grit, chuckled at a joke he barely understood, his laughter catching like sparks on dry tinder. The impossible had happened. Not peace, not yet, but something close enough to try again tomorrow. Later, as the fire burned low, Ellen slipped away to the edge of the room, the weight of the day pressing against her ribs like a corset too tight. Quanah approached, his movements deliberate, his gaze steady. The Comanche chief's face, carved by years of leadership and loss, softened as he inclined his head, a gesture of gratitude Ellen recognized even before he spoke. "You gave him back to me," he said, his voice low but resonant, the words carrying the gravity of a man who had prepared for grief and found grace instead. "Now I give you something too." He pressed a small pouch into her hands, the leather soft and supple, stitched with intricate patterns that whispered of tradition. Inside, nestled like a secret, lay a single eagle feather-bound in red thread, its edges frayed but proud. Ellen blinked back a sudden sting of tears, her throat tightening around the enormity of the moment. "This is your people's way?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Quanah nodded, his eyes unflinching. "For those who carry peace through danger. For those who don't run when others do." She cradled the pouch to her chest, the gesture instinctive, as if the feather might anchor her to this fragile new world. "Thank you," she murmured, though the words felt inadequate, like trying to hold a river in cupped hands. Amos found her just before dawn, the pale light of morning seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls like a promise. He had packed his things, a rawhide satchel slung over his shoulder, the ceremonial sash still tied around his chest, and his posture spoke of resolve, not reluctance. The boy who had arrived at her door, bloodied and broken, was leaving as a bridge between worlds, no longer a fugitive, but a messenger of possibility. "I go with my father to speak peace," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe build more cabins like this." Ellen studied him, the lines of his face sharper now, honed by survival and purpose. "You're ready," she said, the words a statement, not a question. He hesitated, then added, "Just promise me one thing." She tilted her head, her heart clenching at the vulnerability in his gaze. "If you ever send smoke from Yellow Ridge," he said, "make sure it's for good news." A faint grin tugged at his lips, the ghost of a boy peeking through the warrior's mask. "Next smoke is a story. You'll see." Then he turned, mounting his pony with the ease of someone who had already begun to ride toward the future. Ellen stepped onto the porch, her breath catching as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the plains, painting the world in gold. She watched him disappear into the horizon, his figure merging with the shimmering heat until he became legend, a name carried on the wind, a tale etched into the land. The eagle feather hung above her door, dancing in the breeze, a silent witness to the choice that had changed everything. Mercy, she realized, was not a single act, but a thread woven through generations, stitching together what fear had torn apart. And as the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dawn, Ellen allowed herself to believe, not in perfection, but in the stubborn, radiant possibility of tomorrow. As the first light spilled across the Texas plains, Ellen stood alone on her porch, her boots planted firmly on the splintered wood. The eagle feather, still damp from the night's dew, danced in the wind above her door, its red-threaded loops catching the golden dawn like embers refusing to die. Below, the land stretched vast and unbroken, a sea of prairie grasses swaying in the breeze, mesquite trees casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the horizon. But her gaze lingered not on the distance, but on the feather itself, its motion to quiet him to the choice she'd made. She had chosen mercy over fear, and mercy had answered, not with silence, but with the fragile, trembling possibility of peace. The cabin behind her was empty now, its hearth cold save for the faint scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. Amos had left at first light, his silhouette merging with the horizon until he became a story carried on the wind. Yet his presence lingered in the air, in the way the tin noise makers still clinked softly near the windows, in the faint imprint of his cot against the floorboards. Ellen's hand drifted to the rifle leaning against the doorframe, its weight familiar but unnecessary now. The storm she'd felt brewing for days had broken, not with gunfire, but with words, with the laying down of a saber stained with grief, with the unspoken pact between a widow and a boy who refused to be a pawn in someone else's war. She thought of Elijah, of the twins they'd lost to fever, of the panther she'd fought with a shovel and a curse on her lips. All those years, she'd believed survival meant holding the line, drawing the curtains, trusting no one. But Amos had unraveled that truth like thread pulled from a frayed hem. He'd arrived as a stranger, a risk, a child bleeding out on her doorstep. And he'd left as proof that humanity could outlast hatred, that even in the harshest soil, something new could take root. The feather's rhythm quickened as the wind rose, its dance a reminder of Quanah's words. For those who carry peace through danger. For those who don't run when others do. She wondered if Elijah would have understood, if he'd see her not as a fool, but as a woman who'd found a different kind of strength, one that didn't demand a rifle but dared to open a door. Would you have done the same? Could you have seen a child behind the enemy's face, stripped of war, paint, and fear, reduced to breath and bone and the raw ache of survival? Ellen's throat tightened as she imagined the answer. She hadn't saved him because she believed in peace. She'd done it because she'd seen too many lives swallowed by silence, too many graves dug in haste. Mercy, she realized, wasn't a grand gesture. It was the act of kneeling in the dust beside a boy who might die, of stitching his wounds with hands that shook, of facing down riders with rifles and rage, knowing the odds but choosing anyway. And in that choice, something shifted, not just in Red Hollow, but in the marrow of her being. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and damp earth, a promise of rain after drought. Ellen stepped down from the porch, her boots crunching gravel as she surveyed the field where Elijah lay buried beneath the cottonwoods. The land had soaked up blood before, but today it held the quiet triumph of a fence post repaired, of a cabin that had become more than shelter, a sanctuary, a bridge, a story. She reached up, touching the feather as it spun in the breeze. Let the fire burn, she thought. Let spread, not the fire of men with badges and grudges, but the fire of choice, the kind that lights the way long after the sun has set. Would you have opened the door? Would you have held the line, not with violence, but with stubborn, radiant hope? Let the story linger. Sometimes the bravest act isn't holding a rifle, it's opening a door. And sometimes the echoes of that choice outlast the thunder of hooves, the crack of gunfire, the weight of history itself. Let the fire burn. Keep building bridges.